Few modern nations have been influenced by a single leader as profoundly as Singapore. Its remarkable story is dominated by one man, Lee Kuan Yew. Lee's importance in building Singapore simply cannot be overstated. Having a formidable intellect and an unbreakable will, Lee has been the main architect of the national project. He did not build Singapore alone. Devoted and disciplined administrators played important roles. Yet, without his discipline and determination, today's Singapore would not exist. Usually, countries fight for independence. The case of Singapore is pretty unique because it didn't want to become independent and was in fact forced to become a nation of its own. After being a British trading hub for a century, Singapore, under the rule of Lee Kuan Yew and the People's Action Party, achieved internal self-rule. But its leaders knew how hard it would be for a tiny and vulnerable island to forge a path of its own. Singapore is just a small island that has zero natural resources. It even has to import its drinking water. The only strength of Singapore's geography is its strategic location in the Strait of Malacca, a vital global shipping route. Thus, on September 1963, Singapore joined Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak in forming a single state. The advantages were obvious, like access to a big market or protection against communism. It felt like destiny for Singapore to be part of a greater Malaysia. However, almost immediately cracks began to appear in the new federation. Singapore wanted a multiracial meritocracy where everyone had equal opportunities. In contrast, the federal government in Kuala Lumpur wanted the ethnic Malay to dominate. Lee's desire for equality was seen as a threat to the existing order. Political tensions sometimes became violent. In 1964, Singapore had devastating race riots that left dozens dead. Singapore also believed it was paying far more than it should in taxes while getting limited benefits from the promised common market. By mid-1965, the relationship had become too toxic to continue. Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman believed that keeping Singapore would be like letting gangrene spread through the federation. It was time to go separate ways. The separation agreement was signed on 7th August, and just 2 days later, on 9th August 1965, it became official. Malaysia's parliament passed the bill almost unanimously. Singapore was suddenly independent. At a press conference, the usually stoic Lee Kuan Yew broke down in tears, calling it a moment of anguish. He had believed in the union deeply. What was meant to be a lifelong partnership had lasted less than 2 years. Most new nations celebrate independence after long fights against colonial powers. Singapore's story is unusually different. It was forced to become free. In 1965, Singapore was in a vulnerable, almost desperate situation. Many people at the time wondered if the new country could even survive. A small island of roughly 2 million people, no natural resources, no oil, no farmland worth mentioning, not even enough fresh water. It had just been kicked out of Malaysia, losing its economic perspectives overnight. Unemployment was around 10 to 14%, slums were widespread, and the British, whose military bases protected the city and offered a major economic boost, were planning to leave completely within a few years. The regional situation only made things worse. Indonesia was carrying out an aggressive military campaign against both Malaysia and Singapore. Relations with its much larger neighbor, Malaysia, remained bitter after the ugly separation. The 1964 race riots were still fresh in everyone's memory, and maintaining harmony in a multiracial society of Chinese, Malays, Indians, and others was a constant challenge. On top of that, Singapore's traditional role as a trading hub was declining, with no clear alternative in sight. Even Lee Kuan Yew later admitted the mood was bleak. In private, he and his team felt the great pressure of the moment. Yet instead of giving in to despair, Lee delivered a clear and brave message. There was no alternative but to succeed. This no alternative mindset became the country's driving philosophy. He refused to indulge in self-pity or third-world fatalism. Lee, together with his main economic architect, Goh Keng Swee, followed a very simple rule: whatever works, we do it. Ideology comes second. They rejected rigid socialism or protectionism. Instead, they attracted foreign investment to boost export-oriented growth. The government focused on creating the best possible conditions for international companies to invest, rather than trying to build the industries itself. The Economic Development Board became one of the most effective investment agencies in history. Singapore offered foreign companies tax holidays, ready-to-use industrial estates, turning swamps into modern industrial parks like Jurong, Political stability, peaceful labor relations, excellent infrastructure, and an English-speaking workforce. The strategy paid off quickly. Factories producing electronics, textiles, and petroleum products were built. Unemployment fell sharply, and by the 1970s, Singapore had achieved full employment. But Singapore never stayed comfortable at one level. It kept climbing the value ladder. In the 1960s and 1970s, it focused on labor-intensive industries like garments and basic electronics. In the 1980s, it switched its focus to more capital-intensive and higher-tech manufacturing, and from the 1990s onward to high-value sectors such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, finance, and logistics. Today, Singapore is a global leader in many of these fields, and it continues to invest heavily in education, research, and infrastructure to stay ahead. Several key decisions made this possible, and Lee Kuan Yew was behind each of them. He created one of the world's best education systems, believing human capital was Singapore's only real resource. He created a massive public housing program that cleared slums and gave over 80% of Singaporeans ownership of their homes. The idea behind it wasn't just to solve the housing crisis, but as Lee explained, owning property changes a person's mentality. It gives them a real stake in the country's success. When your home's value depends on Singapore doing well, you become emotionally invested in its stability, its progress, and its future. Corruption was punished without mercy. World-class infrastructure like the Changi Airport was built. But Lee's real strength was his willingness to make deeply unpopular decisions when he believed they served the long term. He created strict laws, meritocracy over racial quotas, and tough labor policies that kept wages competitive and strikes rare. He promoted English as the working language despite many people being strongly against it. The country saved money year after year, creating massive fiscal reserves, even when critics called it excessive saving. Lee didn't focus on winning the next election, but on building a nation that could survive for generations. Singapore's healthy finances and pragmatic leadership allowed it to cross major crises, from the Asian financial crisis to COVID, with unusual resilience, while many larger nations stumbled. Singapore took its greatest weaknesses, tiny size, no natural resources, and a hostile neighborhood, and transformed them into strengths, agility, radical openness, and an obsessive desire to be excellent at everything it does. From a painful separation in 1965 to one of the richest, safest, and most efficient countries on earth, its journey remains one of the greatest success stories in human history. We usually remember statesmen from large and powerful nations. Lee Kuan Yew's global stature far exceeds the tiny size of his country. A small island produced one of the greatest leaders of the modern era. His legacy is especially important to remember today, when the overall quality of politicians has dropped dramatically. In these difficult and uncertain times, when we need strong, capable leaders the most, figures of Lee's caliber seem to belong to a different age.